Hey everyone, welcome to this episode of Perspectives with Remy Sharon Pearson. This episode, I am joined by a phenomenal human being. Her name is Dr. Dina McMillan. She is a sociologist and social psychologist who graduated from Stanford with a PhD in the 90s, one of the smartest women you're going to come across. This conversation went far-reaching. We started speaking about her experience of racism and how her mother raised her to have the best attitude when it came to it and how to be very resilient in the face of the racism she experienced growing up in the United States. Then she speaks to the racism she experienced during her Stanford graduate program. And the reason we dwelled on that is because a lot of the work she does now is in programs and discourse around the anti-racism movement and around critical race theory. Another area of specialty that this delightful woman has is in the area of domestic violence. This doctor has interviewed in excess of 700 domestic violence perpetrators. And she certainly set me straight on some of the naive ideas I had around that. And I love that about her, that she was able to articulate some of the science and what the data actually shows when it comes to domestic violence. One of the books she's written is But He Says He Loves Me, is a book about what are the tactics that domestic violence abusers use? What do they utilize in terms of social psychology to win over? I think my term is probably going to be a little sloppy there, but to win over the person they're going to want to have control over. And we discussed some of those tactics. And in this interview, the doctor provides her email address. So if you want all the tactics, a list of them, more than happy to share it with you. There's also a podcast you can tune into, Unmasking the Abuser, which I've listened to and as part of my research for this conversation, where very generously she unpacks what to look for, what the signs are, how to know it, how to see it coming. It's really interesting. As I mentioned, though, part of her work is also on being a critic of anti-racism and on the critical race theory movement. And she has some really interesting ideas there about where her criticism comes from and what a healthier, more functional and uniting approach could be, which is this idea of cognitive biases are inherent in all of us. They are correctable versus an anti-racist theory, which is all white people are by definition racist and can't be rehabilitated, which to me has very nihilistic hopelessness about it and is certainly not extending good intention to anyone. So with these ideas in mind, at the end of it, really interestingly, Dr. Dina combines her ideas around abuser methodology and what's some of the tactics that are going on in anti-racism movement. And we talk about a couple of examples. If you want to go to the show notes, there are a lot of links in this show. There are links to her work. She runs a course helping people recognize abusers. She also runs a program called Healing the Rift, where she explores, I'd say, gentler, more functional ways of overcoming racism that does exist. No one's denying that racism is there, but making it a more inclusive process so we can all be included in it, which to me feels intuitively so right. I would love you to be part of our Perspectives community if you'd like to be. That would be fantastic. So you can subscribe on any of the different podcast channels where we appear. That would be fantastic. I know you probably know this already, but by you becoming a subscriber on every channel you choose, it boosts us in the rankings so more people can hear about our podcast. One of the things we really pride ourselves on is all of this is free. There's no advertising, nothing. We do the whole production ourselves. So to do that and to keep expanding our reach, what we need to rely on is you as a subscriber helping us out. So if you're happy to do that, that would be awesome. If not, just keep tuning in when we turn up, write a cool comment, spread the word, share this episode if you find it interesting or a little bit controversial. And hopefully, as a result of this, we can get some really great discourse going on how to approach domestic violence in a new and really, to me, functional way based on the data, and how perhaps we can approach racism in a really healthy, holistic, unifying way. Stay tuned. And here is the magnificent, the awe-inspiring, and the most heartwarming woman I have met in a long time, Dr. Dina McMillan. So great that you're joining us here today, Dr. Dina. Thank you so much. I'm really honored to be able to connect with you, and I'm so looking forward to our conversation. You are a fascinating woman. I love your brain. I love everything I'm discovering about how you think. And I think that's really important. It's not so much what we think, it's how we think and how we came to what we think about. And you seem to me as somebody who's really thought a lot about how to construct your thoughts and what it is you care about. So share with our audience, for those who don't know you and your work, what is it you care about? What are you thinking about? And how did you come to be here in this moment?
Well, one of the things I do first is I usually apologize to people upon initial meeting, and I tell them, look, I'm a social psychologist, and it's not just what I do, it's how I think. So it is the filter through which I process everything. So it's important to understand what social psychology is. Social psychology studies how we learn, how we gain our beliefs, how we are directed in our behavior, and importantly, how we influence each other purposely, accidentally, subtly, overtly. And it's really crucial to know this because I see social psychology everywhere. And of course, my field, being the evil science, as I call it, does a lot of work and experimentation on how to alter what people believe and how they behave without alerting them that you're doing something on purpose to change what they perceive, how they behave. So a lot of social psychologists that are not at universities go into marketing to convince us to buy things we really don't need, or they go into activism and politics to get us to vote for people we really don't trust, or to sign on and promote activities where we don't really understand how it's going to impact our lives, our children's lives, our grandchildren's lives.
Now, you as a social psychologist, you care about, well, many things, but there's two primary ways you've influenced me. And one is your study of, and I'm fascinated by the fact that you've interviewed in excess of 600 perpetrators of domestic violence. And I'm interested to dive into talking about what you've discovered there, because you share such a richness of understanding of that world. And then you also have a parallel voice and critical thinking around the movement around anti-racism and how to think about racism in a unified, inclusive way. And I'm fascinated to chat with you and unpack more of your thoughts around that and how you think about it. That's what I'm really fascinated by. And then the third piece is how you are seeing the parallels between them, which I'm going to save that as a teaser for our viewers, because it's intriguing how you think about it. And I've never thought about it that way, but I know I've had a discomfort around aspects of anti-racism and how I'm supposed to think about it. And what attracted to me about you and how you think is you helped me understand my discomfort. So I'm looking forward to down the track chatting with you about that as well. Let's start with your background. I've studied your podcasts and I've pretty well all the work I could find on you because I was so intrigued by you and how you think. And you shared in one of your conversations, Dr. Dina, that you went to Stanford and experienced racism there. And I've noticed in all my research of you, you never talk about what you experienced. Is there a reason for that? You always just float over it and say, let's not get into that. And I'm not expecting you to talk about it today. I'm just really curious about what your thinking is there. And I can kind of guess the reasons you don't, but I wanted to hear it from you.
Well, I think that people would get caught up in my experience and assume that I'm suggesting that my experience is the normal experience, the same experience as other people. It's such an individual thing. Although I should say that Condoleezza Rice, the former Secretary of State, was a dean at Stanford at one point, was actually considering putting together a class action bias suit against the university because of the overt racism faced especially by Black women at Stanford. So in that case, it's definitely not just what I experienced. I mean, it was a situation where the professors, if they, I had a class of 9. In the year I applied, they had 735 applicants for the PhD program, and they accepted 9. Stanford prides itself on being the hardest university in America to get into.
Yeah.
It's even harder to get out of. And it was really interesting. I can't help but wonder if they weren't doing some experiments on us, because if we had an appointment we were supposed to have with a professor for a course, they just wouldn't show up to mine. If I asked a question in class, I was ignored as if I hadn't said anything. They used really bad research during my first year, before I'd taken advanced statistics, to talk about how Black people just aren't as smart as everyone else.
What year was this?
God, this is in the 90s.
Okay.
I'm not that old. It's not like 1950. Okay, this is post civil rights movement, and it was still, but it's a private university. They could do what they wanted, and
you didn't say anything for the first year. I have
No.
studied enough to know you stayed quiet until you had the facts.
Well, my mother taught us that. We integrated an all-white neighborhood when I was 6 in the Midwest. And my mother always told us 2 things. She said, first of all, you fight ignorance with knowledge. So she taught us Black American history before we went to school. So when people said, well, you people haven't done anything, we were little Black smartasses saying, well, the first man to die in the Revolutionary War was Crispus Attucks, and he was a Black man. And then we'd start talking, Dr. Charles G., the first man to perform open heart surgery. This was us, okay? I didn't.
Your mother, that is such a loving gift to have given you.
You know what another gift she gave us that was even better? She told us, sometimes when people say things that you find insulting or racist, it could just be ignorance. There's a difference between ignorance and hatred.
Yeah.
The person who says something because they don't know it hurts you or don't know they're mistaken, if you correct them, they could turn out to be your best friend. Somebody who does it on purpose will continue to do it, but don't put them all in the same category. There could be a difference.
What age was this message part of you?
6 and 7.
It's just incredible.
And the fact, that's why when we're going to talk about some of the anti-racism programs, the training for how to handle this so that it's unifying. My mom, I can only take a little bit of credit. My mom taught us this from the time we were small. So you don't go at people, oh, you're white, you must be an enemy. We just were not brought up to think that way.
If we come from a point of view assuming bad intentions, we're going to find them. And if we come from a position of giving best intention as a gift to that person in the first instance, and then being contrary to an archetype or a generalization, we might not move them, but at least we've been true to our values and what we know is foundational to ourselves. That's a good day. But to go out with bad intentions and have that as a value set, I don't see how we're going to have a good day.
I find a lot of what's going on in our society right now really scary, because it's not just contrary to how I was brought up. That's not enough. I actually added science to what I knew, to what I was seeing. And I learned objectivity. Now, objectivity is something you have to actively practice. It's not something you can just claim to have.
Yes.
It's like critical thinking. You can claim you have critical thinking,
Yeah.
but it's something you have to constantly test. So standing back from the situations, they were putting all these studies up about how blacks weren't as bright and blacks weren't as good, and I didn't have the knowledge to dispute it. So I just got quiet and I said, okay, we'll see about that. After I took my advanced statistics, I went back to those same studies that they were using, and I wondered if they were testing us because they used the crappiest studies, and these were brilliant professors. So they knew the methodology was not rigorous at all. It was so questionable. I think they were gauging our reaction. And later on, before I graduated, my dissertation advisor told me that one of the reasons they had a bias against me is because I kept mucking up their expectations. They said
Interesting.
that often, because these are the guys that developed status characteristics and expectation states theory, which says that when we're in a broader society, the status that people have, the hierarchy, it replicates itself when you're in small groups. If you have a small task-oriented group, and the best example I can use of that is a jury, or if you have a project at work, the status of the individual members, according to social hierarchy, will replicate itself in that group. And the problem they were having is they said that I kept testing like a white man. And I was totally mucking up their statistics. Well, part of the problem was I'm almost 6 feet tall. They forgot to add height.
Yes.
When you are tall, you are treated differently than when you're short. I also used to be a model, so I was used to getting away with a lot of crap, okay? People who are good looking get treated better than people who are plain. I'm sorry, this is life, okay? So at that point, I'd lived 6 years in Europe as well as the United States. So a lot of the racism that the average black person experiences, there are places I would go in Europe where being black was an absolute asset. I was treated like I was famous. So they took none of that into account. So they just had dodgy statistics. So yeah, I messed things up for them a little bit. And also, they didn't think I would graduate. Because every couple of years they'd be forced to take a black graduate student. They didn't know I was black until I showed up.
No, they didn't.
But they would take in a black graduate student and they treat us so poorly that most of the black graduate students would quit. You know,
so they were creating their own they were projecting their inherent biases, getting confirmation bias. So they each year could confirm the bias they had. It was a self-fulfilling prophecy.
And most people also variability. As a military kid, I'd lived in various environments. So I was used to coming up against situations that weren't necessarily known and having to deal with that. I had more resilience, I would say, than the average black student. I'd never lived in a ghetto, so they were making assumptions as well. They were assuming who I was and what I was, and that just wasn't true. So
how much of it do you think was also you had your own confirmation bias? You had an expectancy of acceptance, you had an expectancy of you can't stop being tall and good looking. So there is an inbuilt expectation of what happens when you go into a room versus when someone who doesn't have those characteristics walks into a room. That would immediately have muddled what their brains were processing, because you weren't in any way acting like in the hierarchy that you were low down in the status group. You were appearing high in the status group, assuming you were high in the status group. So that neurologically would have fried them.
Yes. And it also meant I interacted with people. I have a reasonably deep voice. I was brought up to be strong, but not bossy and bitchy, you know. Often society right now doesn't know the difference. We can have another conversation about how women are depicted at another time. But I was also brought up to, and I like people. You know, it's like I go around my neighborhood every morning. I get up at 5:45. I live out in Berwick in the burbs. I get up at 5:45. I go out for a walk. I know everybody that has a dog because their dogs all like me. Why? Because dogs can tell when people really like them, you know? So they all come over and visit and they get a little pet, you know, and I just, I am like that with people too. I like people until you show me that you're somebody that's irredeemable, just not redeemable. So I walked into a room, and if I had something important to say, I was used to being listened to. So I carried myself that way.
Yes.
And the other people subconsciously responded to me. It's amazing how often people respond to us the way we expect, which is another thing that terrifies me about critical race theory.
Yes. Yeah.
You're teaching Black kids to expect rejection. Oh my goodness, how is
And
that?
teaching them to expect the worst of me because of the color of my skin. The saddest thing for me, and I know we're jumping ahead here, is Martin Luther King Jr. I am a cliche shaped my thinking because he was in my generation of growing up. And his I Have a Dream speech I wrote down and I studied and I integrated. And when he says we judge by our character, I took that to be true. And to find in critical race theory that is no longer true is so sad to my heart, so incredibly sad that this beautiful man who died for his beliefs and his convictions, who shaped the planet with his convictions and a speech that was never expected. And to this day, to have any of that ever questioned or set aside as not correct thinking, I can't get my old-fashioned head around it. I'm still stuck with Martin Luther King saying, I have a dream that one day my children and the children's children will be judged not by the color of their skin, by the content of their character. How did we get here?
You know, it's funny that you get choked up because so do I. And when I came to Australia, at one point I had to renew my visa and I had all my papers and my visa was expiring at midnight that night and line after line and I'm there and then I get to, and it's about 4:45 and the woman says, oh, there's one form that you just don't have. And I'm panicked because I'm from California. We have such a problem with people who are illegally living there. It's a huge cost. It's not benign like the Hollywood tries to make it seem.
Yeah.
I would never stay here illegally. So I was panicked and then she got her manager and he asked me, why do you want to stay in Australia? And I told him, I grew up hearing Dr. King. And saying that he wanted his children to live somewhere where they're judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And for the first time in my life, that is true for me.
Yeah.
He looked at me, he saw my heart just on the table. He said, get your paperwork in as soon as you can. Welcome to Australia.
Oh my gosh.
So I have been accused of working for the tourist board here. And it doesn't mean I don't love America. I am a proud American. I love my country, but I love this country too.
Yeah.
I will not lie because when Australians do something racist, they're embarrassed.
Yeah.
They're like, oh my goodness, what did I do? How can I correct this? Because having everybody deserving a fair go is down in the soil. It's some Australian soil. It's in the Australian heart. It's in the Australian psyche. And I noticed immediately when I came here. The fact that we're both getting choked up. How unifying is this? It has nothing to do with race.
Yeah, that's so true. It's so true. I trust those words, Dr. Dina. I trust those words. So
they're emblazoned. When I get my
Yes.
autopsy, they're going to see them written on my heart, I tell you. But he could tell I was not. I mean, they must get so many scam artists going through the immigration department. But he knew That was so genuine. And he just said, get your paperwork in when you can. Welcome to Australia. I was like, oh my God.
Yeah. So you began to correct, and I know I'm delving. I've watched your other conversations with people. None of them delve so much on you as a person. So if you don't mind, I just want to stay a little longer with you. You got to year two. So I'm sure most viewers know Stanford is one of the most prestigious and hard to get into universities on the planet. It is considered an Ivy League school. It's one of the top 8 universities in the world.
It's
Top
number
5.
4. It's
Number 4.
It's number 4. Yes.
In the world. And you're a graduate there. You did a master's in sociology, you then did a PhD in social psychology. You waited 1 year to have facts, and then you began to challenge the bullshit data. Can I ask what the ramifications of that was? Did they change? I'm hoping for they changed their curriculum and stopped saying crap. What happened?
Oh, nothing except I continued to get treated badly the whole time I was there. I mean, the first time I went back to Stanford after graduating and moving away, we were driving there from the airport and I started to shake. I mean, PTSD, oh my God, it was horrible. But again, in my head, I'm watching people get set on by dogs, hanged from trees.
Yeah.
What is this in comparison? I need to one day be able to look at my ancestors, to be able to look at those civil rights workers who were beaten and raped and fired. And I need to be able to hold my head up when I meet them. I could not do that if I fell apart this first time I ran up against a barrier. I just could not. So the whole first year, I cried myself to sleep every single night.
Yeah.
People think, oh, you're tall and you're strong. Oh, please, that's fake. I'm a marshmallow. So
also, you're human and you feel we all feel the pain of being separated and to be rejected or to not be accepted into a group. And your group was only 9 people. It's pretty obvious if you're being ostracized. That's a very human response.
So I would cry myself to sleep every night, and then I'd get up, get dressed. And I had my daughter with me who was 3 at the time. And I could not let her see me falling apart. And later on, she said, because she was 9 when I graduated. And she said, oh, wouldn't it have been so much easier if you didn't have a small kid while you were at Stanford? I said, I never would have made it through.
Wow.
I knew who I was suffering for. I looked at her face and said, I do not want it to be this hard when she gets to be an adult. And unfortunately, that's not true, because race theory, all of the wokeism, all the stuff that's been happening since the late 90s is taking us backwards. And it's so many people suffered so much. I'm sure that wherever, God bless him, Dr. King is buried, they're having to rebury him because he's turning in his grave.
Yeah.
I look at this, it just makes me so tired. But yeah, I just kept getting up and going. One thing that you should know, you're Australian, you may not know this. At least 10 million of us died in the Middle Passage, in the slave ships that took us from Africa to the Americas. At least 10 million of us.
I did not know that.
And when we got, unlike the blacks who settled in the Caribbean, the blacks who settled in America were not, in the United States, were not allowed to keep any language, were not allowed to keep any aspects of their African culture. And they were all put together with people who were warring tribes, different tribes, others of Africa. If we did not have resilience, we would not have survived. So what I'm doing is drawing on my DNA to get through. And compared to what they went through, at least I was perceived as a human being. At least I wasn't shackled. At least I didn't have to have sex with any of my professors. The thought, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
But look at
it's not enough, though, to say, at least I didn't, because we're here for, I would have thought, unity and equality. And there is nothing any human being should have to do to prove their equalness. other than a willingness to show up. So that's where I would challenge that. The at least, I don't think is enough for.
No,
I don't think the job's done if you're going to say at least. I think we've still got work to do.
it just got me through the first year, and then I
I
started
get that.
and started using the knowledge of advanced statistics and research methods, because we have kept having to take more and more advanced research methodology as courses. And I went over that research again, and I saw that they were using absolute crap. So I also understood that they were using their knowledge and their position as a weapon against me.
Yes.
But it was one where I got to decide whether it would work or not.
Yes.
And I said no. And at one point, they were so biased, I told my professor, who became my dissertation advisor, please inform them they have two choices to get rid of me, because they wanted me to quit like they got most of the other Black people to quit. I said they can kill me dead and bury me in the ground, or they can put PhD behind my name. Those are their only two choices. So since I'm not dead, guess which one I got?
You're amazing.
But this is what I told him. You know, I come from amazing people. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm looking at this critical race theory of the Black Lives Matter destruction, where all the people at the top of the organization are getting rich, but they're not doing anything to fix cultural norms that are causing Black kids to be so behind and have so many limitations. They're not doing anything to make it better. And I'm like, do we share the same ancestors, really? This is what everybody sacrificed for, so that you could get a house in the suburbs where you're the only Black person in the suburb? That's what all of this was about? I don't think so. There's just nothing, there's no giving back. You know,
Okay, so we're going to come to that. Let's start with your work in domestic violence, if that's okay with you.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Yeah, I had to resist the segue because it was so perfect that you gave me, but I'm going to.
No, that's okay. That's all right.
So I read your book. I've got the title here, but he says he loves me, How to Avoid Being Trapped in Manipulative Relationships. And I read that book last week, and I thought it was absolutely fascinating. Can you please share with our viewers your very unique take on domestic violence and how, as a social psychologist, you approach it?
Well, initially, when you go into any field, you look to the other people in that field for direction on how to think about things. Yeah. So I've been working on and off for almost 9 years in various jobs in domestic violence. And I got to the point where I was absolutely fed up. I thought, this is just such a painful field. We put a Band-Aid, gaping wound, and then the next week, the person comes back and the wound is even worse. I just can't do this. So I had to quit. So I had originally gone into the field because of my daughter's best friend's mom came to me and said, you're a social psychologist. She doesn't know what a social psychologist is. She thinks I'm a clinical psychologist, and said, a close friend of mine is going through an abusive relationship. Is there anything you can do to help? And I tried to help, but I really didn't know enough. So I went back and got more training specifically in domestic violence, and seeing it as a field where there was so much need, I ended up doing more and more work in it. And I just got fed up and said no. So I was going to quit and become an interior designer, as you can kind of notice.
Of course.
I was like, okay, I've had it. This is it. So I go out for a walk and I said, all right, what am I going to do next? What are the steps I need to take to transition from being in domestic violence to being in something where I get to make places beautiful, you know? And then all of a sudden the word from above came, and it was like, boom, in my head. And I literally heard this. I'm not schizophrenic, by the way. I just want your audience to know that.
Yeah.
The words came, you're doing it wrong. And I went, what? You're doing it wrong. And then all of a sudden, all of my social psychology, which I had been kind of holding back over here, because nobody I was working with was a social psychologist. Nobody in domestic violence was using that kind of information. No. all the social psychology that I've been putting on hold just flooded into my brain and just merged with all the information that was in my head. And I realized that there were specific tactics being used by abusers. These were visible, that they were consistent. They used them every time. They were universal. I was hearing the same stories no matter what race, creed, color, or nationality of the victim or the perpetrator, and that there weren't that many of them. There was just a small list of tactics all of these guys were using. And I said, oh my God, if we can, and I realized something that nobody else, none of the women that I'd ever come across, no victim, no survivor, ever realized. I only knew a handful who actually recognized they were being manipulated. But even those handful, even that handful, thought the manipulation came later. They didn't realize, and what I did as a social psychologist, how early the manipulation started. So I started thinking back to all of those interviews. It's closer to 700, by the way, by now. All of those abusers that had spoken to me in those confidential interviews where they knew I had to take whatever they told me to the grave. So they were extremely open and honest. I, at that point, had been more than 2,500 survivors, victims and survivors. Now it's closer to 5,000 victims and survivors. And I'm putting all this together, and I said, oh my goodness, those tactics and that manipulation starts being used as soon as the relationship starts. If we can show what that looks like, we can keep women from getting involved with abusers in the first place, because getting away from them once you're involved with them is extremely challenging. So why not make it easy? So I naively thought, if I present this information to the industry, to the government, they're going to say, great, because we're spending billions of dollars on this. But what taken into account is that there's a whole industry where people make their living from people getting involved in these relationships. And they were highly resistant to someone coming along who would teach women how to stop themselves from becoming victims in the first place.
Something's just occurred to me that hadn't occurred to me when I was reading your book and watching your TED Talk. And I do recommend go and watch your TED Talk. It's terrific. It's just occurred to me. What you're doing could be accused. Your work could be accused of being victim blaming. I don't believe it is. If you want to make it the most black and white, simplistic way of looking at it, because I think the industry around domestic violence is built on let's blame the perpetrator, front headlines the perpetrator, the woman was beautiful and loving and shouldn't this, all true. Not the point I'm making, to viewers right now who are chucking shoes at the screen. My point being, we've made it so black and white and so dichotomous and so simplistic. The perpetrator is bad. The woman is never, ever, ever to be in any way questioned. Now, I'm not saying we do question her. What you're doing, though, is saying as a woman, and it's generally the woman you're addressing, you have a choice here. And someone simplistic could say you're victim blaming. Have you ever had that, or is that... I had that all the time. So I'm just catching up with the discourse.
No. I get that all the time. And it's interesting, but I never get it from anyone who takes my workshops or my seminars.
Yes.
Because what I talk about is the fact, and what I criticize is the aspects of culture that teach women to be prey. The aspects of our culture that condition women to ignore our instincts, to think we're more female and more feminine and we're more valuable and we're more valid if we make excuses for perpetrators and for mean people. If we're nice to someone who's mean to us, it makes us feel like we're a really good person.
And it's also feminine to be understanding
and trusting.
He's having a bad day, and he's had a long day, or but he provides everything. And without him as a single mom, I'd have my kids alone. So we are trained culturally and socially to be acquiescing to a situation that isn't great for us, but seems to be great for everyone else.
Well, we're taught to rationalize, and I actually explicitly talk about which aspects that we're patted on the head from the time we're little girls. And this is one of the reasons, though, please understand, I want your audience to understand, even with my podcast series called Unmasking the Abuser, where I go through the tactics explicitly, I even have an episode specifically for straight men, how to pick up the indicators and the tactics of abusive women.
Yes.
I don't want people to think I only think males are abusive. That's not true. There are abusive women. The difference is males are not socialized to accept it. So when the indicators show up, usually most men will back away immediately.
Yeah.
Women to do that. I want women to react to abusers the way men react to abusers.
Yeah.
Most men who end up in a relationship with an abusive woman had an abusive mother.
Really?
On some level that it's been normalized in their minds, but it's nowhere near as prevalent. And that's the only reason. But I don't want teen boys or young men to think, oh, I'm invulnerable because I'm male and abusers are
perfect.
Since I date women, it's not going to happen to me. Look for the tactics of the abuser. You can spot it in friendships. You can spot it in, whether the person's a man or a woman. You can spot it in employers or colleagues. You can spot it in social movements and groups, marketing tactics. Once you know what it looks like, the manipulation to abuse, you can spot it whatever the demographics of the person who's doing it.
This is very empowering.
Extremely. And that's why I was so stunned. And I even went to the New South Wales government, for instance. I went to them and said, I actually paid a financial analyst to figure out how much would be saved by rolling out my program. I said, even if you have a 1% to 2% fewer women going into abusive relationships, and when I say women, I mean teen girls as well.
Yeah.
It would have saved, and now this is like 2008, 2009, it would have saved $29 million a year.
Wow.
That's just one state, $29 million. Forget it's the right thing and forget anything else. Let's just talk tax money, our tax money. Yep. And they still wouldn't do it.
And what was their thinking? Do you know? Can you mind read their thinking, or did they share their thinking?
They didn't share it, but I can definitely understand it. Expectations of the public, until we get a critical mass, if you read Malcolm Gladwell's book, The Tipping Point,
yes,
until we get a critical mass of people demanding that we teach all young people about these tactics, that we also have available in community centers and at offices, because this is not the wisdom that comes with age. It is social psychology. So you will not, just because you've been abused, you won't know this. This is why there's no victim blaming. How in the heck are you supposed to know this stuff?
Yes.
You don't learn it just because you've gone through it. Not one of the 4,000 victims and survivors I've interviewed actually knew the list of tactics that abusers use or how early they show up. I was given a gift of knowledge because I'm a social psychologist. How in the world could I blame somebody for not knowing this?
Of course.
The blame, though, is the government, both federal and state, because they've known about this program since 2007. Why aren't they rolling it out? And not just in the schools, because young people model their relationships off of what they see at home. So if you don't get every generation in your family on the same page,
it perpetuates.
It will still, and this is subconscious, it's not conscious.
It's not deliberate.
It's not deliberate.
This isn't me perpetrator bashing either. I have compassion for all roles of any form of victimhood, and the perpetrator is as much a victim as anyone. That's a terrible statement for many viewers. They're going to be outraged, but that perpetrator was a victim who was victimized. They're not going out deliberately thinking, I know how to F up that person's life. I'm going to do the 17 strategies that will do it. Much of it's unconscious. I'm sure that came out when you spoke. No, oh, go challenge me. I love it. Tell me.
I was stunned. Now, first of all, you should understand when you're actually talking to people doing a lot of these interviews, you learn like the passive face and the nod. Okay. You actually learn it in graduate school when the professors are going on and on and on. But you learn to keep your face expressionless and you learn to do this understanding nod. But if they could have had a screen behind me showing me, it would have been like my hair would have been standing on end. I was stunned and amazed at how conscious the behavior is by the abusers.
I'm so disappointed.
Exact opposite. Now,
compassion bubble.
Not completely.
Okay.
85 to 90% of the abusers that I spoke with in detail, in depth, had been either had the opposite sex parent, usually their mother, who was abused, or they were severely neglected as children. So there was a psychological, they had a psychological dysfunction there. There was something awry in their psychology. But as a result of this, they felt no compassion for their victim. Their victim.
That I feel compassion for. That you go through life not feeling empathy for another human being. I believe that's one of my best characteristics. I admire it the most in people, to not even know how to access that.
Well, they might felt compassion for someone else, but not for their victim. They viewed their victim as their property. They were proud of their ability to manipulate other people. I'm telling you, I was stunned. So when women saying he doesn't do it on purpose, he said something just overcame him. If I got him in an interview where he knew I couldn't tell, that's not what he would tell me.
Really?
They were like, I need to keep her in check. She needs to, to do what I say. I don't want her to become predictable. I had a bad day. So she's there to accept whatever I give her. It gave them joy to be able to mistreat someone and have this person take it.
That is some really messed up wiring. That is some messed up. Oh, that is really, wow.
Well, another thing I also do in my seminars and workshops, when I see all these guys that are just getting ready, if they were turtles, they'd have their shells ready, because they're like, oh no, here comes another woman that's going to be talking about how bad men are. I like men, and I do not do that. So one of the things I have as part of my seminar is I tell them in mainstream culture, if you're talking about who's an abuser, who's the kind of guy that I just described, we're talking perhaps 8 to 10%. So 90 to 90% of men, I am not talking about them. So every guy always takes a deep breath and they sit back in their chair. So it's like, I'm probably not talking about you. Nobody else ever does that. So there's what's implied is that they're one drink or one job loss from becoming Oscar Pistorius, and it's just not true.
And I think this term toxic masculinity is, it just makes me so sad that we can talk to teenage boys in this way and characterize them as just this big group that is toxic. How is that going to empower a young man? We know the power of shame on young people, that shame is one of the hardest viruses to get out of our system psychologically as we grow up, and adulthood is the one we carry the longest. It evidences itself in anger and in sadness and depression, and it goes on and on. Yet we are literally shaming young men. You've heard about the stories here in the East in schools. We did it in Victoria, didn't we? Yeah, we had one school teacher have all the young men stand up. I think they were 12 or 13. Please, if I've misquoted this, someone will correct us in the chat, and explain how toxic they were and how they were predetermined to be toxic males. And they were shamed this way. And I'm thinking that's a lifetime of a scar they're going to carry for being shamed and humiliated.
That teacher should lose her job. That is cruel. First of all, even if people come back at the end and say, well, we're not saying all aspects of masculinity are toxic, But when you link them that way, it has an incredibly powerful subconscious impact.
Yes.
Get the masculinity out of it. Let's talk toxic behavior.
Love it. Yeah.
Toxic behavior, because it can be male or female, narcissism, entitlement, inability to have compassion, inability to empathize. We can teach what we need to teach without making masculinity seem bad. I mean,
Fantastic.
telling men to wear dresses. We're doing everything we can to teach males that what they are is not good. And I just won't participate in that. You talk about going against, no, I won't participate.
Yeah, I won't participate in that. I'm not going to shame anyone to forward any agenda that I could possibly have. If my agenda involves shaming someone, I've got the wrong agenda, and it's me that needs to pull back, because I'm not going to shame anyone in the pursuit of getting my way.
Well, I'm very solution focused. So even when we do things when people do things that I don't like, my next step is always, okay, this is getting a certain result that's not what we want. How do we fix it? It's not about shaming anybody. It's like, how do we fix it? Even looking at how do so many women end up in abusive relationships? Of course, implied within that is that they must want that. One of the hardest things to fight is that people look and say, well, they must want a relationship like that. I've spoken to so many top range of society, industry, government people who in a private conversation just do not think we can do anything to reduce domestic violence. And it's not true. It's not true. And we can start with society just as it is. You know, we went from not even talking about it. Now we keep focusing on gender equality. Need gender equality in order to fix domestic abuse. Because if it were about gender equality, there would be no abused men. Fix it right now with society exactly the way it is. We don't have to wait 25 years until maybe we kind of sort of get gender equality.
So it's not about your ideology in any way. It is about science. So would you please share, I know I'm familiar with them, but would you share with our audience a couple of the things to look for in the early stages? So you say, hi, how are you? And what would be an early clue that probably, because here's the thing, Dr. Dan, I believe whilst people don't ever want an abusive relationship, if that's what they've known and they equate it with love or they equate it with them being acceptable, then I know I am programmed to seek out certain kind of people. They make me feel a certain way. They bring out aspects of me I want to have brought out. I'm very comfortable with it. I know that's a lot of it is my conditioning and is way beyond any conscious thought that I have. I think to have an abusive relationship, possibly those early signs would be a warning sign to one person, because that's not love, because I have a healthy relationship with love. To another, that's not a warning sign, because their conditioning is such.
I wish it were only women who came from backgrounds of abuse who were vulnerable. I would still help them, but it would be a much smaller percentage. Unfortunately,
Yes.
The way women are socialized, we're all vulnerable. Because if you look at any chick flick, you look at the popular TV shows for women, they are all emphasizing, reinforcing, and promoting attitudes and behaviors that make us vulnerable to abusers.
Great.
So one of the things I would say to look out for. So first of all, number one, accept the fact that you are vulnerable. It's just like when I talked about social psychology and I said the first thing they taught us was that knowledge of a phenomenon does not make you immune to its effects. So the professor said it doesn't matter how advanced you go in social psychology, if you are exposed to the influence mechanisms, to influential information, if you put yourself in a situation where you're surrounded by this influential material, you will be influenced just like someone who didn't know anything.
Got it. Yeah.
It's saturation and exposure. So understand that you are vulnerable, that your children are vulnerable, because so many women think, I don't come from a family with abuse, so I'm not vulnerable. I've never had an abusive relationship and I'm in my 30s. I'm not vulnerable. all of us are vulnerable. And you
Mm.
add in really bad cultural norms around sexuality and relationships, that increases our vulnerability. So the next thing you look for is too much too soon.
Yes.
One of the things about abusers is that they find the initial stages of a relationship extremely painful. They are only comfortable when they have total control over their partner. So in those initial stages, when she still has some autonomy, still has personal agency, still may potentially walk away from them, they find that extremely uncomfortable. So they move fast.
Mm.
Now, all the stuff they do is not bad. I think one of the biggest issues, the one biggest shortfalls in the information about domestic violence is that whenever I would pick up a brochure or a pamphlet, it would always have all these negative behaviors. And they would use the word too a lot. Look out for a guy who's too jealous, too possessive, too controlling, but they never told you how much is too much. Okay.
Mm.
And they made
Mm.
it seem like abuse is all about pain. It's not. It's also about
Mm.
pleasure.
Yeah.
Clever abusers know how to make their prey, their target, feel good. So when I talk about the tactics, I talk about things like love bombing, where you
Yeah.
meet him and he tells you you are just the best thing ever, that he's never felt like this before, that you're just the most clever, beautiful, wonderful woman, that he can imagine having children with you. So look out for that.
This is got to be, some viewers are going to be going, really? But that's what I thought I wanted to hear. Because when I read that in your book the first time and I listened to your podcast, I was like, there are a lot of women, particularly because I know more women, who would think hearing that level of attention being placed on us is going to fire up dopamine throughout our entire system, surely.
Until I train you.
Yes.
Train you, because my training, I call it your superpower. Once you have your superpower in place, that will make you wary, because someone telling you you're the best thing ever and they don't know you
Yeah.
is playing you. And
Yes.
your superpower says, first of all, you will not play with me, you will not manipulate me. A really good guy, I even teach the difference between an abuser and a good guy. An abuser does this, and a good guy does this. And we're talking about the positive stuff.
Yes.
So a guy who really likes you, some of the stuff that these guys do, he would be too nervous to do it. He wouldn't be offering you trips and talk about how gorgeous your children would be, because he'd be too afraid you'd say no. He'd be a little tentative. He'd really like you, but he wouldn't start making plans for your future together, because he doesn't know whether you'd agree. And he's afraid of rejection. There's a huge difference between a genuinely decent guy and an
Mm.
abuser, and I will teach you that too. I want everybody to be happy in a mutually respectful relationship where you both cherish each other. And you can, once you learn, you really can't tell the difference. It's just too over the top. Too many compliments, too many promises, too much talk about the future, too many gifts or promises of gifts, too early in the relationship, teasing you, calling you his future wife, teasing you, introducing you as his girlfriend the second or third time you go out. You really can tell. It should make your skin
Yes.
crawl. It should not.
Yeah.
It should
Wow.
not be flattering. It should make your skin crawl.
Wow. Okay. And there was another indication you said was where they will, this to me felt very like common knowledge, but maybe it's not. It's where you speak about them wanting to prevent you seeing your own social set or seeing your family. And one of the ways you wrote about that they can do that is turn up and make dicks of themselves in that setting. So you feel really cringy and really less encouraged to do that. I had never thought about it that way.
I had a girlfriend who was dating a guy, and every time she invited, he would not, he made her feel bad if she went by herself. Because one of the things is, it's you and me against the world. We're joined at the hip. they make it seem romantic that they give you no space.
Mm.
Abusive guys show up at a baby shower where everyone else was a woman.
Mm.
She had a choice, either bring him or he's going to make her feel so bad and throw a temper tantrum and just be so difficult if she went by herself. So she had a choice of either going with him or not going at all.
Mm.
So they will claim your friends flirted with them or made a pass at them. They will say things, intimate things in front of your work colleagues.
Wow.
They will be really quiet and reserved, and then later on the way home, just constantly put down everybody that you work with, convince you that those people really don't like you or respect you as much as you think they do. So they are.
And that's an isolating tactic, isn't it? They're doing it it's almost like get you away from the herd and get you away from your tribe. So if you're alone, then the dependency is going to increase. I still get a sense, though, and I'm trying to figure out where I'm not gauging this correctly, where it's about acquiescence. Because for anyone to attempt to do that with me, I'm not going to acquiesce. It's really going to be, that's a little bit too much too soon. You need to chill your jets. So I'm hearing a theme of acquiescence here, that if you're acquiescent culturally, you're going to let that play out and tell yourself and be understanding about it, because acquiescence requires a lot more understanding than healthy boundaries would require. Am I still getting that not quite right? Is there a Venn diagram here?
You do have to acquiesce, but what you're not taking into account is how clever some of these guys are. Now, realize that the manipulation starts when he selects you.
Yeah.
And most abusers have preferences. A lot of them are lazy and want women who have already been brought up in patriarchal cultures or rural environments where, everything's separated by sex and women are taught that they have to submit, or in an abusive relationship before and you've normalized that kind of thing where you're making excuses for his behavior already. Or the second situation is he has every advantage over you. So you get involved with someone, you are working at a nail salon, and he's the head of a Fortune 100 company. If you look at 50 Shades of Grey, the whole premise of that, she's an emotionally vulnerable young woman.
It's basically just Pretty Woman, but with a red room.
Well, actually, no, because in Pretty Woman, at least Richard Gere treated her better.
Yes.
Christian Grey is a sadistic psychopath.
Yes.
And he hunted for someone who would acquiesce to everything he demanded. So he got someone who was emotionally neglected and vulnerable, young, inexperienced, not terribly attractive. And he swoops her up and he turns her into his toy. So that happens a lot. When you see couples where one person has, is financially successful or really super bright or really good looking or really, there's just a huge difference between them. It's a power play. And then there's the third type. There are abusers who actually enjoy breaking women like a spirited horse. So they get involved with women, like what you have just said, who they see as a challenge. I have them coming after me. And I wrote the book literally. Okay? Because they understand intellectual knowledge is not the same thing as that primal part of you that chooses your partner. So you can be intellectually so smart.
Yep.
But when it comes to that primal aspect of yourself and your view of yourself as a woman, you could be completely vulnerable.
Yes.
So I even in my podcast series, I have a whole episode where I talk about all the little tricks abusers use if the woman is independent and savvy and she's not a typical victim, what you would think of as a victim. How do they convince this woman to get involved with them? So I have things like being Harry helpful, He's the neighbor that's always willing to pick up your stuff or give your kids a ride if you have to go to work early. And he just makes himself so useful that he insinuates himself into your life. There are just all these different ways that smart, clever women can be tricked into getting involved with an abuser. And once he gets in, he's going to start isolating. He's going to start undermining her self-worth and self-confidence. He's going to start encouraging behaviors, what I call feeding the weeds, where they tell you you're right when you're wrong. And if you continue doing those behaviors, you don't get promoted. You start to lose friendships. Your family doesn't feel as close to you. It's a way of isolating you. And then he can point the finger back at you and say, they're mad at you because of what you did. So it's really sneaky.
So self-esteem goes down, self-confidence in your own judgment is going to decrease, which is going to maybe, as a consequence, if we're in this kind of relationship, lead to a high dependence, hoping that they will pull us out of our slump in bad judgment. But they're there to constantly undermine our judgment. So we're just stuck in this cycle. Yeah.
And it's funny.
That's a long game. That's a long con.
Except it works fast. It's amazing how, let's say you have an argument with somebody on your staff and you come home and you tell Joe, this new guy you're going out with, oh my God, I can't believe she did that. He will exaggerate how bad it was. You were so right to fire her for putting the coffee cup back in the wrong place.
Yeah.
That's so disrespectful. And you had told her before, oh, I am so with you. I am glad that you're the kind of person who stands up for herself. So it would work fast.
Yeah.
Fast.
So where does it come in? What role does intuition play in this? Because I'm feeling like now I'm hearing we shouldn't trust our intuition because these are really clever tactics. And in the face of strong tactics, I don't know how reliable my intuition and my conditioning is.
I would say with the superpower that I'm teaching, don't rely on your intuition because your intuition is too vulnerable to social conditioning.
Yeah.
Our conditioning may have quieted some of our primal nerve and our primal intuition about who's dangerous and who's not.
Yeah.
That's why I want people to have specific knowledge. I even ask them to email me and I send them the list of tactics. So my email is unmaskingpodcast, all one word, @gmail.com. And just tell me you want the list of tactics. Okay. Yeah. I will send the list of tactics and there aren't that many. Once you have them, you can recognize them when you see them and you know emotionally to start pulling back.
I also want to recommend your book, But He Says He Loves Me, How to Avoid Being Trapped in Manipulative Relationships. You wrote a book that I read in one sitting, and the way you opened it, I found viscerally difficult to read. I literally had a visceral reaction. So the viewers know, I'm not going to give too much away, Doctor, but you open by taking the point of view of an abuser's handbook. And you literally write it, to be an abuser, this is my advice for you. To be really good at your job, to be good at abuse, this is how you do it, and you do it in this sequence. And by page 5, I think my skin was crawling. It was...
Well, if you'll remember, I actually, the introduction to the book, I warn the reader that it's going to be very confronting. So I advise the reader. What I did was, there was a book called The 3-Minute Millionaire, and I read it years ago. And it had a story on one page and information on the other pages all throughout. I thought that's an interesting way to do things. So when I decided to write But He Says He Loves Me, I wanted to give information on the tactics, but it also really bothered me that I hadn't met a single woman who really understood how these men think. And I, of course, could never actually reveal anything that would identify a specific guy. So I said, I'll make a guy, take out the bad language because it's not necessary, and make this an amalgam of all the guys that I meet. So it's basically a guy saying, this is how you train your woman. And when I was writing that side, I was channeling what I had been hearing. So I kept having to get up and stop typing and go for a walk.
Yes.
So I warn people, read the right-hand page first, because that's my voice saying, this is what these guys do. This is the tactic. But on the left-hand page, at the top, it says the Abuser's Handbook, because Robin Brooks, who at that time was working for the Benevolent Society in Campbelltown, we had gone to a survivors meeting, and the women were all so different from each other. And she turned to me and said, we've been doing this for years. I've been doing this for much longer than you. And it's amazing to me. It's like these guys, no matter where they come from, they all read the same handbook.
Mm.
So I said, the Abuser's Handbook. So there we go. So it really is literally, they are, please understand, again, I cannot emphasize this enough. They are very aware of what they're doing. It is not accidental. It is not spontaneous. It is not something that they're really sorry for. It's not because a red mist came over their face.
Yeah.
They know how to manipulate to get their way in the same way your 3-year-old knows that if they look tearful, that grandma and grandpa will let them have sweets before the meal, even though mom and dad say they're not supposed to. Manipulation is not hard. It doesn't require an advanced intellect. It requires cunning. And that's what they have. They have cunning because it's important to them. They want a relationship. They don't like being alone, but they don't want anything but the kind of toxic relationship that they have.
What's the name of the course?
The course?
Yeah, what's the name of the program?
Oh, the course and the podcast series are both called Unmasking the Abuser.
Yeah, I recommend it. That's fantastic. Thank you. Now we are going to segue awkwardly and without any grace, because I don't know how to, into your other work that you have articulated to me in a very accessible way. And that's, you're speaking about critical race theory. And maybe we should start there, Dr. Dina. Would you like to explain critical race theory for viewers who perhaps are not informed?
Well, critical race theory was initially a theory developed by lawyers looking at the infrastructure that built the United States. And most people may not know this, but in our laws, there were laws about keeping the races separate and what was appropriate for one race or another. In order, I would say not just laws, in order to have what they call structural racism, you have to have it built into everything from religion to schools to
Banking.
Until the
Insurance.
60s, a lot of banks had official policies where they would not give mortgages to Black people.
Yeah.
And even after they changed the official policy, they have something still that exists in many banks called redlining, where they put a line around predominantly Black areas and will say that those areas are too risky to provide loans. So if you're going to open a business, if you're going to get a mortgage, it's really hard to get a loan or a mortgage for that area.
Or they up the mortgage.
Or the interest rate is so high that it's prohibitive. So the theory.
And so when interest rates go up, they're more likely to default on their mortgage payments, and so replicating the cycle.
And critical race theory looks at this infrastructure, this systemic racism that had been built into the basic foundation since the beginning of what became the United States, and are professing it still exists in so many fundamental ways, and that therefore the system itself, the whole culture, is based on this foundation of white supremacy and racism, and it's unfixable. Now, one of the things people weren't thinking about, if you're saying something is unfixable, then the only solution is to destroy it all.
That's it. Just tear it or ignore it. Because if I'm unfixable, Dr. Dina, my attitude is, well, then why bother? So I think it's two approaches. It's one, burn the whole thing down, and the other is, all right, I'm not fixable. I'm just going to stay where I am.
I always said whenever there's a Black Lives Matter protest, the Ku Klux Klan gets a whole new groups of members, because it just doesn't make any sense to encourage Black people to burn down their own neighborhoods, to be aggressive, to steal. What about all the looting that was being encouraged? And one of the biggest issues that Black people have is being perceived as criminals. So you have a group come along supposedly to help you that is encouraging your criminal behavior by not only giving you literal applause from on high, but also those people on high providing bail funds so that if you do get arrested, you get bailed out. How in the world is that going to help us? I saw it as terrifying. You know, if you look at what works in a society, one of the reasons the United States was a rare example is because, unlike other cultures, including the one I'm living in now, we don't glorify multiculturalism. We glorify the fact that no matter where you come from, you become an American. So what we did was take that difference, that divisiveness, and say, yeah, okay, but here's the common goal that we all share. This is how we work together. American kids often would brag about how many different ethnicities they have in their family, how many different nationalities they have in their family. It was all about being American. And that's why it was an unusual experiment, and that's why it worked. And a lot of people think Americans are too jingoistic and too just promoting America this and flags everywhere. When you have people coming from all over the world, you have to keep reminding them, we have this in common. This is our common goal. This is what we're building together. Otherwise, they separate into groups, and the groups are always at each other. Mm. You look at cities like Chicago, Boston, New York, where you have ethnic enclaves that have been there for more than a century. And any politician would tell you that those groups have so much animosity against each other. They don't vote the same way. It doesn't work. But when people were encouraged to move out west in the United States, everybody had next door neighbors that looked different than they did. Yeah. And by all combining to be American, it had everybody pulling together. When people, it is similar to domestic violence. And you mentioned something about us having a very dichotomous view. All perpetrators are bad, all victims are good. Well, in Australia, they have this thing where I've had people brag to me, oh, this area has 159 different languages, which means they can't communicate with each other, which means that if you encourage ethnic enclaves, you have a powder keg, and all it's going to take is one event and it's going to go off. There has to be an emphasis on what do we have in common. We share this land now. So being Australian needs to be the goal. But it takes cojones to actually say that, because
it doesn't to me. So let's unpack that, because I'm hearing this just thinking, well, anything beautiful in history, anything that I admire, which is Buddhism, and thinking in terms of shared consciousness, is about unity. Yoga means unity. Everything I admire and uphold as being true and real for me is about unity. So to me, what you're saying isn't in any way controversial.
But it's shocking to some people. And by the way, my daughter has studied yoga and is now a yoga instructor. So
beautiful.
But it is about, it's about more than food. Australia has an attitude that they'll welcome any ethnic group that has good food. I don't think that's I think it's hilarious. But if people bring age-old animosities here, if they never actually become Australian, then all it's going to take is some sort of stressor within the system and it all breaks apart. If being Australian is really valuable, then even if there's a little bit of animosity, the system will bend but not break. What they're trying to do with critical race theory is to set up a system of absolute animosity, unbreakable animosity between whites and blacks, and make the average white person feel so guilty and so shame-filled about ancestral crimes that they can then be manipulated by any black person who tells them to kneel, to disrespect, our icons and our what we consider important, anything unifying. They're teaching people to disrespect it as a way.
When did critical race theory move from structural racism, which I think there is always structural elements that we can improve? I agree with that. When did it become and equate with, if you're white, you're racist? What happened there? Do we just look at D'Angelo? Is there other commentators there? What happened?
I think it's basically started. As I said, admittedly, I would have to talk to a historian. So I am not a historian, I'm a social psychologist.
Sure.
This is just something that I'd noticed since with the progressive left movement from the 1990s, where they started promoting a lot of lifestyles, attitudes, behaviors with very poor research behind it, that they were promoting a certain way of looking at groups, cultures, ourselves, that was not supposed to be questioned. And underneath it, it was tearing apart the family, tearing apart the society. At the same time, critical race theory is promoting all this racist everything. They're also forcing a diversity at a level that is just insane. So
superficial.
Every
diversity
you see
based on looks is so superficial. One of the things I say is I'm interested in diversity of opinion, a diversity of thinking, and a diversity of ideas and how you think. I hire based on diversity that way. Just for anybody who's listening thinking, oh, that means you're justifying hiring white people, that's not true. We actually have won diversity awards based on people's appearances, if that's the thing you're going to care about. But I can't care about that, because if I don't care what you look like, if your ideas are dumb and you don't contribute to my business, I don't really feel the need to pay you. But that's not what they're saying. They're saying diversity is literally pigmentation. And I find that so superficial.
I have to disagree with you here. It's not just pigmentation. It's pigmentation and a sense of entitlement. So I have a friend who she's become a friend since COVID. She's one of my COVID blessings. Professor Carolyn M. West, who it's because I'm writing a book, a follow-up book. One of the books I'm writing as a follow-up to Buddy Says He Loves Me is specifically around the culture of Black American women. And because I needed help with this, I found a professor in University of Washington in Tacoma who's always being quoted because she is like the preeminent authority on this. I contacted her about a year ago, and because of COVID, she wasn't lecturing and said, hey, why don't you Zoom me because I can't lecture. We've now become very good friends. And she gives me stories of some of the things her students come up with. Like, I don't have to complete the assignment because I was in foster care growing up. This culture of victimhood.
Yeah.
If, they're talking about, some of these universities are talking about changing the criteria for entry. Black kids don't do well on standardized examinations, so let's stop it demanding those for entry into the school. And do you know where that's going to end up? They're trying to create a society where if I go to a health practitioner, I would only get a Black health practitioner. Although I'm not allowed to ask for a woman. Because if the woman is a man who identifies as a woman, I'm supposed to just accept that. But
My head just exploded with all of the ways I have to get this right and the rules I have to know about. One of my biggest concerns about critical race theory and woke in general is its elitist nature. We are speaking right now in a woke code. Basically, we're speaking code in terms of what's in and what's out, what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. And the rules are constantly changing, and I do stay updated with them. I don't agree with them. Some of them, I think there's a point there, but I think it's more subtle than nuance than perhaps is being presented, but there's no room for nuance in it. But I find it elitist, Doctor, because there's a bunch of people who don't have the time or the desire to be as informed as I am about woke rules and dogma, and have no clue and should not have to have a clue, but they're immediately judged as excluded because they don't know the woke code. They don't know the anti-racist code. And
oh, I know it. I just choose to ignore it. Actually, I'm worse than that. I'm fighting against it because for me, a basic rule of life is this: anything real and genuine bears up under scrutiny. If there is something that you're looking at, and also we can't fix anything if we don't have accurate data. So you're looking and saying, I did very well on standardized exams. I did very well in school. But if you're looking at standardized exams and saying, hey, a lot of Black kids don't do well on this, then you figure out why. Yeah. You change the training, okay? You don't change the exam. So here I go to a health practitioner who may or may not be female, whether I ask for a woman or not, would be Black, unless, well, they haven't quite gone, you can identify into sex, but not into race, although that doesn't, actually it would make more sense the other way around, but anyway.
How do you feel about that? If I can identify as any gender that I choose to, why is the line drawn at identifying with any race that I choose to? How is it that the identities draw a line there? What is the differentiator?
Because when you're making stuff up, you get to set the rules.
Okay.
Identifying into different genders makes no sense whatsoever. Because what it does is, only thing that it accomplishes is make it really hard for women to fight for equal rights. Because you cannot fight against discrimination if you cannot name yourself and have clear boundaries. I also, for me, working in domestic violence, teaching people a superpower, it requires, I also have to have a separate section to teach women how to say no. Part of our conditioning, part of our cultural training is to have fluid boundaries because we're taught not to hurt anybody's feelings. That's why so many women end up in abusive relationships. And it doesn't just harm them, it harms their children. Yes. So you cannot be teaching firm boundaries, how to say no. Channel your inner Dr. Dina. Say no and mean it. It's a full sentence. No. I cannot do this. And then at the same time, be told that any male that decides today he identifies as a female is able to breach any boundary that I have, and I can't say anything about it or I'm a bad person. Yeah. That is the most, I have to say, it is the most socially destructive ideology I've ever come across.
Mm-hmm. It's a doctrine that is enforcing one rule for everyone, and the moment we lose all nuance, then the rule can't be true. It can't stack up for everyone.
And it changes by mood. And I'm looking at someone I was recently talking to in the UK who wants me to help take my Healing the Rift program. That's the name of my program.
Yes, it is.
To reduce racial bias and other types of bias in a unifying way. It's called Healing the Rift. And he heard about it and asked me to adapt the program at his training college and training university for therapists in the UK. And one of the things he quoted was, he said, the Hopi Indian women, the Native American tribe, whenever they would talk about plans and strategies, the grandmothers had a position to be the last speakers, and they would always ask the question, but does it grow corn? So I look at all of these different ideologies that are being promoted by the woke, and I'm looking ahead, but does it produce a stronger society? And the answer is absolutely not. So for me, anything that does not allow itself to be analyzed and scrutinized, anything where I am coerced, like the Spanish Inquisition, where I have to adapt my thinking, my beliefs, my values are ignored. You can't have multiculturalism and promote wokeism as the only thing that's allowed to be respected. You either have to have one or the other. We have to find what we have in common and let that be the basic underlying rule. I am so tired of diversity and inclusion, meaning promoting woke values, and everybody else can look different, but they have to keep quiet about the way their values actually diverge from what woke says is right and true. It's a very domineering way of seeing the world, but it's not new. It's been going on for more than 20 years.
I didn't realize that. I did my research a while back. I was so surprised to see how long it had been going on. One of the ways you do work to promote inclusion is you speak about bias, not just racial bias, but natural biases, cognitive biases that are inherent in all of us based on our upbringing, what we're used to being around. It's not that big a deal. It's very natural. I have a bias. I admit it, for pink. I do. I like the color pink. I'm going to wear a lot of pink. I don't know why. I just prefer being around things that are pink. So then what you've done, which I love the nuances, you've said, well, bias is natural and normal. And correct me if I'm not interpreting your message.
No, you're right.
Yeah, it's natural, it's normal. We can accommodate it. So one of the examples you give is where your sister didn't want to hire someone, and she's into wokeism and she's into diversity training, but she was against someone, couldn't work it out, and she realized because she's from a military background, the poor candidate didn't have shiny shoes, so she didn't want him to get the job. So she corrected for her natural conditioning and allowed the applicant to proceed with their application. That to me sounds incredibly common sense. It sounds ridiculously, inanely available to all of us. And yet it's not the message I feel I'm allowed to have. That my natural biases are somehow wrong. My biases can be for something or against something. I have a bias against red meat. I just do. Can you share a little bit about how having bias training rather than anti-racism training is going to be more inclusive?
Well, for one thing, it doesn't differentiate by race or ethnicity or religion or sex or height or anything else, income. And it looks at, there's bias that is based on your personal experiences. There's bias based on what you heard growing up. There's bias that is based on cultural messaging. The social messaging we get is very biased. The stories in the media, when you're watching a film, watching a TV show, all of them have very distinct messages in them and distinct biases. So if you understand that there's going to be bias in there and you learn simple steps to step back from your bias, what my sister did is basically what you have to do always. You step from it and she said, why am I so against this guy? He seems like a good candidate otherwise. What am I? And then there was self-awareness, which is also important. So she's figuring it out and says, it's because Daddy always said, if you don't show up somewhere without shiny shoes because it's disrespectful, having this military dad.
Yeah.
And it had gone in and actually stuck in her brain. So this guy was applying to be a state police officer, so that military aspect of it would have transferred over.
Yeah.
Stood back from it and said, I'm being biased against him. It's not fair to him. And so she said something to the other guys. That's all it takes.
Yeah.
And also, if you have people you trust,
and not shaming her. I think Dr. Dina, the other thing, we're not going to shame her over the bias she had inherent within her.
No.
We're not ostracizing her. She's not going to get cancelled for it. It's just okay, let's bring some self-awareness to this. Is this going to be the most inclusive and most expansive way of proceeding in this moment? Probably not. Maybe we need to adapt and change how we look at it. That to me seems the most inclusive, kindest, most compassionate, and most progressive way of making progress.
Absolutely. And also, I agree with you about shame. It's funny because, again, upbringing. My mother grew up in California around Japanese, including people that were put into the camps during the Second World War. But she picked up one of their cultural norms that is so different from Black American cultural norms, in that the Japanese have a norm that the worst thing you can do to someone is make them lose face. You'd never really embarrass someone. So for me, that's something else that I've picked up. So to shame somebody is to embarrass them.
Yeah.
And for me, that's a primal thing that I was taught from the time I was small, just not to do you, and also ask yourself, will it grow corn? Will you actually, if you shame someone into doing something, instead of educating someone and informing them how they could do something better, eventually that shame is going to have a response. And often it comes back as anger. So you're going to eventually, you could make an enemy where you could have made a friend by just informing them, but not embarrassing them.
So speaking of which, there might be a lot of viewers who don't know about this example. I know you spoke about it on another podcast. I want to speak about Ashley Shackelford and that infamous video.
Ashes.
So Paul, our producer, will include a link or maybe even a little video clip if we have copyright to it. There is a video clip that you can search for, viewers, Ashley Shackelford. And this isn't me shaming her. This is an example of why I believe we need to balance the discourse around genuine racial issues, structural issues that are still inherent within particularly the American system, and how to reconcile those issues in a way that's inclusive, progressive, and I mean it with a small p, not a capital P, that allows us to come together and unify. That seems to me a great outcome if we can do that.
Me too.
Shaming and blaming people for the past is not going to move us forward one step. All it does is make me feel like shit and I don't want to do anything. It's very demotivating for me.
Yes.
So there's a video clip, and this isn't one example, there are a number of it, where racist trainers are coming on stage and writing, if you're white, you're racist. You can't not be racist. You will always be racist. You are a demon. Another comment, you are not human. It's not your fault. You were raised not to be human. I invite our viewers, if you're still thinking that's okay and whites need to hear this message, replace everywhere I said white with the word black. There would be literally an outpouring of venom towards the speaker. Is there anything you want to add to that? And it's not what all anti-racism training is like, but it's informed by this idea that white people are inherently racist against black, not Asians, not Asian Americans, but black.
Well, I looked at, there's so much to say about Ashley. I just thought it was pretty clever to say all whites are racist. PayPal me. She also has a sign that says, so you can make up for it by sending her money. I made a joke on social media about that, about saying, so if I ask all of you to send me money to compensate for any racist thing you've done, they all laughed because they knew I was joking, except one weird guy who said, oh, I'll be your white wallet, Dina. And I was like, ooh.
Oh, that's really creepy.
Block. Okay, so I was not, everybody else knows me well enough to know that that was a joke. But I can the guilt. People don't you can get temporary compliance from shame and guilt.
I'd like to think I'd have walked out. And am I thinking too much of myself?
No, but you're not American.
True.
So You know, they're really setting the groundwork with all of this information. Everywhere you look, the saturation level is different here.
Yeah.
For
Yes,
me,
that's
for
true.
instance, I don't watch free to air TV unless I watch the Weather Channel or something, but I don't watch free to air TV. So I'm not constantly being saturated with commercials and content
Yeah.
that's telling me what, you know, that this, I'm entitled to something from you guys because you're white and I'm black.
Mm.
I just, where do you go from there? Are they trying to send all white people to the Klan? Do they want all white people to be white supremacists just to, what I've been really happy about, for instance, is that there are enough white people with enough self-respect to say no.
Mm.
And I was contacted.
It's a little different. I agree with you, but most of it's private, Dr. Dina. Most of it's in private conversation. It's really hard to go public when you could lose your job. And I won't, because we don't have the time. I can quote so many examples where people have spoken up in the mildest ways and lost their careers. That's a big and heavy price to pay.
I'm probably at around $200,000 in loss in the red from speaking up against woke philosophy and how to do the world. If I were going to go woke, it would be so lucrative for me. You know, especially my American accent in Australia, I sound like I could come out, you know, entitled, blaming everybody, and all the masochistic white people would give me money and we would destroy our society. But I was contacted recently by Brian Bartning, who started FAIR, its Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism. And he's in New York, and he started this organization when he pulled his children out of school. Because not just the anti-racism training, the gender ideology, the sexuality training, all of that has gone so far from the core beliefs of 90% of the population. And most people are being so passive, they're just sitting there and letting it happen. They're allowing their children to be turned into their enemies. And Malcolm X said, only a fool would let his enemy teach his children. So I was very thrilled when, and this is recent, when Brian contacted me and said, would you be willing to take this Healing the Rift and your social psychology about how the brain works to help shape what we're offering? It's more effective because you cannot fight against wokeism with information. You have to use influence mechanisms, just like the ones that have been used to brainwash and condition and indoctrinate the public to think these things are okay. But it's good to know. So I'm openly fighting against this, but I'm fighting, that's an aggressive word. I don't mean necessarily being aggressive. What my goal is not aggression. My goal is for us to unite as much as possible to build the best planet we can, that we take care of and nurture. And just like a relationship, we cherish it on all sides. That's my goal. But I have to be willing to stand up and take enormous criticism, loss of positions, loss. I had some people in the US try to get my visa taken away in Australia.
Wow, I'm sorry to hear that.
It is not easy to go up against.
No, it's not.
But if we don't do it, Western society will be gone in 20 years.
Yes. Yes.
We have
my view is
to oppose it.
I'm going to take what you said. I'm going to go a little further. My goal in my world, so I create my own bubbles. I have my own businesses and I create my own bubbles. And in our bubble, unity is where we have commonalities and differences are respected, where mistakes are permitted because it can contribute to our learning. So as a white person, if I make a mistake in terms of a racial comment, I expect that to be forgiven. I expect to learn from it, to grow from it. I don't expect to then have to do a big outpouring of grief and shame on social media. I expect it to be handled privately and respectfully and not to be shamed in public because I'm willing to have this conversation. I expect everyone else to be given the same consideration and kindness. I want a world where we can make a mistake and then discuss it openly without feeling that anyone's being belittled at all, so that we can all contribute to the discourse, because that's how we become brave in our ideas. And I want bad ideas to be okay, because that's how we get to good ideas. That's the world and the bubble I like to create. That's what I want to create with these discussions. That's what the whole point of perspectives is to allow discussions of different points of view where not everybody has to agree, but we all have the right to have the view, to be able to say it. At what point do we stop that? Do I then give a full stage to a Ku Klux member when they represent everything that I find abhorrent and pretty well are a checklist of things that I would reject and get very hot and bothered about? Is there a line? What do we do here?
It's your program. That's
I didn't mean my stage.
No, but it's like, it's my, it's interesting. Why is it so important to listen to a Klan member? But yet when we have these critical race theory people, if you look point for point, probably have more in common with each other than they do with the rest of us.
I think they would really disagree with you.
I don't care.
Yeah, I know you don't.
I'm looking at it as a social scientist. Both of them think they're protecting their race. Both of them think that the values that they have are the best values for the country. Both of them think they're protecting the family and the community by completely rejecting everyone else.
Yeah.
We have places where people are talking about having, they're having top universities having racially segregated graduation ceremonies, racially segregated housing.
Yep. Segregated classes.
How is that different from what the Klan's celebrating? It's like, wow, we don't have to even do anything because we'll get criticized. They're doing it to themselves. But it's not taking us anywhere. Neither side is taking us where I personally want to go. I loved having neighbors of all different races, creeds, and colors, especially my Persian neighbors who were always having family events, but they'd make too much food and all of us would get the leftovers. Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
I told you.
I know you're laughing. It's a true example, but it can come down to simply Dr. Martin Luther King. Again, if we bring it full circle, it's back to that idea that it's our character and everything else is superfluous. What's the word? Superfluous.
Yes.
Now, to bring it to close, Dr. Dina, you have an interesting way of bringing your work around domestic violence and your research around that and applying it in anti-racism, in some of the space in anti-racism. And I just want to do a caveat to the viewers. I don't think everybody who's anti-racist is down for some of the more extreme examples and views we're sharing. Again, I'm going to invite our viewers, actually, Dr. Dina, are really nuanced and very mature emotionally. They're all good with understanding. We don't mean everyone all the time in every situation, no matter what. One particular example of how you combine this that you speak about, and I'd love you to speak about here for our viewers, there is a scene that I found very disturbing out of America during the Black Lives Matter riots, and I find it distressing. It's when a crowd of protesters descended on a woman. Everyone in the restaurant had to raise their fist in black rights salute. And one woman was eating her meal in the restaurant and refused to put her fist up. And that to me is an example of abuse. She wasn't racist by not raising her fist. She was eating her meal that she had paid for. And if this indicates I support you berating me and standing over me and threatening me, I will not raise my fist. And I thought, more power to her. Would you like to include your thoughts on this?
Well, when I saw that happen, it was interesting because the brown shirts and the Nazis used to do the same thing. No. They would go to people and force them to give the Nazi salute and say Heil Hitler. And I'm seeing that kind of coercive behavior. That's why, as I said, when people listen to my podcast or they get the list of the tactics used by abusers, I just found it fascinating how many parallels there were between that kind of coerced behavior or be punished that you see with abusers, but you also see it with certain social movements. And in no case, if it's wrong for a person to do that to their partner, it's certainly wrong as a social movement. And the more of us that speak up, the better, because courage calls to courage. And we have got to be brave enough to say, I certainly want racism to decrease. I have suffered all my life because of racism. I am very supportive of genuine anti-racist efforts.
Absolutely.
But I will not support something that's going to make racism and divisions by race even worse, even stronger, even harder to fight against. And that's what we're up against right now.
You're a beautiful woman. Your heart and your mind, the way you express yourself, your passion, your bravery. I'm so grateful that we have you sharing your message. I really trust this touches our viewers, and it will certainly get the conversation going. Thank you so, so much. Is there anything you feel that needs to be added to this so that your voice is being represented as fully and cleanly as you would want?
Well, just the fact that I do have a book, Buddy Says He Loves Me.
Yes, let's find out how to reach you. We'll do all of that. So would you like to do that now? How can we reach you, get in touch, hear your message?
Well, you can reach me via email at unmaskingpodcast, all one word, at gmail.com for anything you'd like the list of tactics. I also have a program called Healing the Rift. You can look up my name, Dr. Dina McMillan, and look at my YouTube videos. I have one called Why You're Not a Racist, another called Bias Isn't Bigotry. I'm going to be producing more, and I have a whole slew of interviews that I've done with influencers now in Australia with you, Remy, but also in the US and the UK. So let's join together and build a better planet, but let's do it together, not by hating each other.
No, I love that. That's a great message. I think we'll include links to everything you just said, and we'll also include the Martin Luther King Jr. speech, I Have a Dream, because I think that represents a lot of our discussion. Well, to me, it represents a lot of our discussion.
Me too.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so, so much.